and gentlemen, my name is Luvena Susanto.
And my name is Mr. Hwang.
Today, we will be talking about freedom of speech. And the question we want to ask ourselves today is whether there should be a limit to freedom of speech or not. Stockwell Day, a former Canadian politician, once said, "I believe in freedom of speech, but I believe we should also have the right to comment on freedom of speech." And that is exactly what we will be doing tonight.
So, why did we choose to talk about freedom of speech? An event that happened in the beginning of the year that inspired us to ask this question. It was the Charlie Hebdo shooting, which also led to the Yes to Charlie movement concerning one's right to freedom of speech. On January 7th, 2015, two brothers, Saeed and Sherry Kouachi, stormed into the office of Charlie Hebdo, a French satirical weekly magazine, armed with rifles. They killed 11 people and injured 12 others in the building.
After the shooting, the question everyone was asking was why? What was the motive behind their attack? Previously, Charlie Hebdo had published several controversial cartoons that depicted the Prophet Muhammad, which the Quran does not explicitly forbid, but which a few hadith do. And because depicting Muhammad is forbidden in some Islamic teachings, the publishing of these cartoons was seen as an insult in the eyes of many Muslims. So this offense led to hatred towards the Charlie Hebdo magazine and was considered to be the principal motive of the attack. Michael Morrell, a former deputy director of the CIA, suggested that the motive of the attackers was absolutely clear: trying to shut down a media organization that tried to lampoon the Prophet Muhammad.
No matter what their motive for, violence is unacceptable. Yes, we must condemn the display of offense and insult toward the Islamic belief, but we must also condemn the terrorism and violence. This could not be said better by Alan Dershowitz, an American author. He said, "Being offended by freedom of speech should never be a justification for violence."
And if we dig deeper into the Charlie Hebdo incident, we believe that the fundamental source of violence was caused by the over-exercising of freedom of speech. And this is what intrigued us to explore this topic, the fact that freedom of speech led to violence. Which brings us to evaluate freedom of speech, what it is, where, and how do we decide where the limit is. Before we begin to evaluate freedom of speech, we must first understand what it is. According to Oxford Dictionary, freedom of speech is the right to express any opinions without censorship or restraint.
Each country in the world has their own law regarding freedom of speech. The international law of freedom of speech established by the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, states that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions and without interference, and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen states that the free communication of thoughts and of opinion is one of the most precious rights of man. Any citizen thus may speak, write, print freely, safe if necessary, to respond to the abuse of this liberty in the cases determined by the law. It is interesting, however, that the French press law of 1881 states, guarantee freedom of speech, subject to several exceptions. It criminalizes incitement to racial discriminations, hatred, or violence on the basis of one origin or membership to an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group. Could it not be argued that Charlie Hebdo cartoons were inciting religious discrimination? Does that mean that the French government is effectively limiting their freedom of speech?
The law of freedom of speech in some of the countries, such as China, Indonesia, and Canada, are also suggesting that there is a limit to freedom of speech. The Constitution of the People's Republic of China claims that every Chinese citizen has the right to freedom of speech, but it is prohibited to use that freedom of speech to attack an individual's dignity, race, religion, and socialist system. The Indonesian constitution states that freedom of speech is the right of every person in Indonesia. But the exercising of freedom of speech must be controlled so that it does not lead to slander and or libel. In Canada, everyone has the right to freedom of speech, but it is illegal to publicly incite hatred against people based on their color, race, religion, ethnic origin, and sexual orientation. So we can see from the law regarding freedom of speech in these countries that freedom of speech is already being limited by prohibiting its use to attack other people's differences so that it does not incite violence or hatred.
Referring back to the Charlie Hebdo incident, we believe that perhaps Charlie Hebdo did cross the line of this limit to freedom of speech by depicting Muhammad. And how from this depiction it stirred up hatred, discrimination, and prejudice of Muslims towards the magazine, and ultimately led to violence. If we take out the terrorist attack, however, we have to ask ourselves whether Charlie Hebdo intentionally incites violence and hatred of the Muslim towards the magazine. Should the fact that Charlie Hebdo is a satirical magazine be taken into account? The editor of Titanic, a German satirical magazine, responded to the attack and the Charlie movement by saying, "We are scared when we hear about such violence. However, as a satirist, we are beholden to the principle that every human being has the right to be parodied. This should not stop just because of some idiot who will go around shooting." The mayor of Paris, Anna Hidalgo, also said, what we saw today was an attack on the values of our republic. Paris is a peaceful place. These cartoonists, writers, and artists use their pen with lots of humor to address sometimes awkward subject, and as such perform an essential function.
So what we've been saying so far is that freedom of speech should be limited because it can lead to violence, hatred, or discrimination, which is why some countries put a limit to their freedom of speech. And the Charlie Hebdo is not the only example where this has happened. Other examples include the reign of the Nazi Party in Germany, or more specifically, the way Hitler abused his freedom of speech while everybody else had none. His anti-Semitic ideology that was presented in his propaganda and speeches convinced and indoctrinated the Germans that the Jews were hurting their job opportunities, thus stirring up anger in the Germans. This anger gave him public support for massacring the Jews. Another example would be the Islamic State of Syria, Iraq and Syria, also known as ISIS. They exercised their freedom of speech through social media to promote extremist Islamic thinking, to reach and recruit more extremist supporters. This inevitably leading to more violence, to more killings, and to more massacre for those who don't follow their religious values. Based on these negative consequences, freedom of speech should then be limited, explaining why some countries like France, China, Indonesia, and Canada put a limit to their freedom of speech.
However, this is just one perspective in answering our questions, a rather negative one, that freedom of speech should be limited because it can lead to violence and hatred. Another perspective is more of a positive one, how freedom of speech can bring to a better things such as bring about justice and equality, political and social transformation, and introducing new ideas that can inspire people. For example, the case of Edward Snowden, who disclosed the secret of the NSA, and how this was seen as a patriotic act by the people because he exposes the violation of the constitutions, and in his words, quote, informing the public as to that which is done in their name and that which is done against them. Another example can be seen by Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech during the Civil Rights Movement. He uses his freedom of speech to fight to end racial segregation and discrimination of Black Americans, which ultimately improved the status of Black Americans in the United States. Another example can be seen from a series of revolutionary protests for regime change, free election, human rights, and economic reform during the Arab Spring, which began in 2010. They changed the political structure of the Middle East and ended the long-term dictatorship. And lastly, the introduction of new ideas during the scientific revolution. We can pull an example from the publication of Copernicus' heliocentric theory that challenged the traditional geocentric paradigm that was held by the Roman Catholic Church. which ultimately led to a groundbreaking scientific discovery and allowed modern physics to be formed.
So we said before that freedom of speech should be limited because it can lead to violence, hatred, and discrimination. But by looking at the positive consequences that was brought about by freedom of speech in these events, the question of where the limit is becomes very important. Because if freedom of speech can bring about both positive and negative results, then we must make sure that what limit we put in freedom of speech does not take away the positive impacts that it could bring. And as we look deeper into all of these examples, despite the differences in their intentions or consequences, the common feature between all of them, including the Charlie Hebdo incident, is power.
In the Charlie Hebdo incident, the magazine has the power of the pen and the media to express the satirical view on the Islamic beliefs. In the case of Nazi Germany and ISIS, they wanted power to dominate the world based on either their political, social, or religious value. In the case of the Civil Rights Movement and the Arab Spring, the white race and the totalitarian government held great power in the society. Therefore, the ones who were suppressed fought for equality. As for Edward Snowden and Copernicus, they believed the government and the church has been feeding the people with false information. Therefore, they felt the need to disclose the right information.
All of these examples include people who were in power and those who were not. And those who are in power can control which cultural and moral values are sacrosanct in society and which are not. While the ones who are not in power fight to gain that power or fight for equality. That is why every society claims to have some form of freedom of speech that ironically always has exceptions. For example, you cannot insult based on religion or government ideology. This reminds us about a line from George Orwell's 1984, which states that who controls the past controls the present. Who controls the present controls the future. As we are living in an increasingly globalized world where different belief systems come into contact with each other on a daily basis, we see a struggle for which political, religious, or moral values will gain legitimacy. And offenses due to freedom of speech will become more common, not less. Whether through violent action, spirited argument, or protests, each group will fight to put their values in the spotlight. And the manner in which a group does this can in fact be a reflection of the power they have or do not have. Perhaps this is the case where the more violent the protest, the less empowered they are, which might have been the reason for the Charlie Hebdo shooting.
There is a problem, however, with saying that there should be a limit to freedom of speech. In that, if a society decides to value freedom of speech, then there can be no exceptions. Otherwise, freedom of speech becomes a tool to be used for those who is in power. For instance, in the ancient Greece, Socrates was a strong believer of democratic ideas. He was made to commit suicide for leading the youth astray with his ideas. There will never be a right answer to whether there should be a limit to freedom of speech or not, where the limit is, and how we decide where the limit is. Depending on where you live, the politics, the culture, the social dynamic of the country, and who is in power will change the limit to freedom of speech. But what we can conclude is that this limit should be built upon tolerance and respectful of other people's differences, so that our differences does not create any more tragedies like the Charlie Hebdo shooting, or any more social division. Instead, it creates a more diverse, unique, and colorful world. Thank you.